Once upon a time, the land was considered sacred, and native peoples of North America viewed themselves as children of the Weken, the great spirit that created all living things. The Sioux, among the main tribes that inhabited the Great Plains region, stood out for their social structure and bravery in combat. The Sioux ancestors reached the forest of north-central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the Mississippi River shortly before 800 AD. By 13 AD, they had embraced the hallmarks of a tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. The Sioux made up a confederation of several tribes that spoke three different dialects: the Lakota dialect, the Dakota dialect, and the Nakota dialect. The Lakota consisted of 7 tribal groups and were the largest of the 3 groups, occupying land in South and North Dakota. The Dakota lived mainly in Minnesota and Nebraska, while the smallest of the 3 groups, the Lakota, resided mostly in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. The Sioux were a prideful people with a rich heritage. They were rulers of North American plains and grasslands feared by other tribes, from the Great Lakes region to the Rocky Mountains. They settled in western Minnesota, establishing a nomadic lifestyle on the plains. They used horses extensively, animals originally brought to the Americans by the Spanish. In the 16th century, their main source of food was buffalo meat. To assist in the buffalo hunt, the Sioux lived in tents that allowed them to move quickly and keep up with the annual migration of buffalo herds. While the Sioux were known as great warriors, the family was seen as the center of Sioux life. Children were called Wakanshin, which meant sacred being, and they were the center of their care. While monogamy was most practiced, Sioux men could marry more than one wife if he proved able to support them. The male and female roles were clearly defined, with men responsible for supporting and defending the family. Hunting was very seriously regarded, and infractions of hunting rules could lead to the offender suffering the rousing of his tent or other property. The Sioux were deeply attached to spiritual practices. They believed the nature's sacred spirits brought visions and prophecies to help guide human actions. Religious dancing was common among the Sioux. Self-sacrifice rituals, inflicting wounds on themselves, affirmed their identity as warriors. This was also carried out as a sign of mourning for the death of a close relative or tribal chief. One common belief among Sioux communities is that the spirit of the deceased would travel to an afterlife. In traditional beliefs, the spiritual journey was widely believed to begin as soon as funeral procedures were complete, which took for days. The grieving family and friends would attend that four-day wake to follow the spirit to its final resting place. War was another core Sioux principle. Men built their prestige through war, and warfare was reflected in their family's honor. The warriors were called akakas, and they mainly fought on horseback, having their main weapons bows and arrows, spears and hatchets. The Sioux Dakota entered an alliance with the French merchants. At the end of the 17th century, the French were attempting to gain an advantage in the struggle for the North American trade against the English. The first reported encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers and traders and des grossiers reached what is now Wisconsin. During the winter of 1660, there was another indigenous group that traded with Europeans, the Ojibwe, who inhabited southern Canada's Great Lakes region. The Ojibwe were remarkable for their large population and expansionist tendencies, which led to conflict with neighboring tribes. The Sioux started to resent the Ojibwe trade with the French and other rival tribes, such as the Cree and Assiniboine. Tensions escalated in the 1720s and led to a drawn-out war. In 1736, the Dakota Sioux lost their traditional lands around Leech Lake and Millie Lakes when they were forced south along the Mississippi River. As a result of the battles, these conflicts within the tribes were also dangerous for European traders. Regardless of which side they traded with, they were seen as enemies by the other. Still, trade with the French continued until the latter gave up on North America in 1763. The Europeans repeatedly attempted to create between the warring tribes to protect their interests, but with limited success. As the United States developed into a nation, the American colonization of new lands became more frequent. The Sioux had many of their lands raided, and several peace treaties and negotiations were made and breached. Railways hired poachers in the 19th century to exterminate the buffalo herds, to force the tribes onto reservations. As the buffalo almost quickly became extinct, both the Dakota and Lakota were forced to accept reservations set by the Americans in return for the rest of their land. Domestic cattle and corn were given in exchange for buffalo, making the Sioux dependent on the government for access to their basic food. The United States aimed for the treaties to encourage the Sioux to convert their nomadic hunting lifestyle to sedentary farming, as done by Europeans and Americans. By 1858, the Dakota Sioux had only a small patch of land along the Minnesota River, with no access to their traditional hunting grounds. They had to rely on treaty payoffs for their survival, often delayed the enforced lifestyle change. and vastly underpayments from the federal government, financial hardship, and increased social strains within the tribes. By 1860, too many Sioux were famished, and tensions peaked in the 1860 to Dakota War. The first major showdown occurred in 1854 near Fort Laramie in Wyoming, where 19 American soldiers were killed. In retaliation, American troops killed about 100 at their camp in Nebraska in 1855 and arrested their chief in 1866. The Red Cloud's War was fought and ultimately ended in a treaty that granted the region known as the Black Hills in perpetuity to the Sioux. But the treaty was not honored by the United States. In the 1870s, gold miners swarmed into the region. Helpless and with no hope for a better fortune, the Sioux and other tribes formed the largest Indian camp ever seen by white men. Around 10,000 Indians, divided between men and women and children, tried to subsist in a place inadequate for all the families. Tired of the incessant harassment and violent retaliation to tribal chiefs, the famous Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse managed to get the support of Sioux warriors and their allies. This led to a series of Indian attacks on and small towns owned by the American colonists. The American government appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer under the command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army to fight the Sioux and suppress the Indian attacks. Custer was known and hated by the Indians several tribes already. He had a habit of attacking Indian camps when the warriors were absent and then murdered women and children. The ensuing fight became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn and went down in the history of the American West. Conquest. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place on June 25, 1876. The fight was a crushing victory for the Lakota Sioux and their Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. The 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men, suffered a major defeat. 5 of the 12 companies on the 7th Cavalry were wiped out, and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, a nephew and a brother-in-law. Custer's body was found with 2 bullet wounds, one in his left chest and one in his left temple. Either wound would have been fatal, even though he appeared to have only bled from his chest wound. Some scholars believe that his head wound could have been caused after death. It is possible that upon receiving a gunshot wound, Custer committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture. After this battle, the Sioux split into multiple groups. The American troops massacre of an estimated 150 to 370 Sioux women and children in December 1890 heralded the end of the Sioux resistance against the American army. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, Sioux descendants had continued to fight for the right to remain in their homelands. They had asked for compensation for the abuses and committed by American troops in the past. As of 2018, compensation totaled over $1 billion. However, the Sioux declined payment, demanding the return of their land. Today, the Sioux uphold many separate tribal governments scattered across several reservations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. The Sioux are living a modernized lifestyle that bears scant resemblance to their ancient nomadic ways, but the fact they are part of one of the most courageous of the North American native nations still remains a source of pride and dignity for their descendants.